Hello, my name is Paul Spears with Oasis Digital. Earlier I recorded a video talking about Modl Buildr. I explained why we created it, what it does, gave a brief tour of some of the features. Now I wanted to take a step back and talk about how we created it and give a brief technical explanation of the code behind it. In particular, I wanted to put a focus on the Angular code that we used to create it. So to start, I just want to give a brief tour of the technology stack that is built on. Here we can see the directory structure for the application. We have a server folder. We created this on Node, Node.js, so we use npm to manage our server-side dependencies as well as our tooling. We also use Bower to manage our client-side dependencies. And then we put all this together using gulp as a task runner to create our build process. So we actually write Jade files instead of HTML. For those that aren't familiar with Jade, a quick 5-second explanation is essentially a syntactical shorthand for HTML that uses indentation instead of XML formatting. So here we have the head element indented underneath HTML, and the Jade preprocessor then creates HTML where the head is contained within the HTML XML element. So moving forward with that brief explanation, let's take a look at the index file. So some highlights for the libraries that we're using. We're using Twitter Bootstrap for styling. We have a custom theme built on top of that, and then a custom layer of our own for some themes right here. And now if we skip down to the JavaScript, you can see that we're using, of course, Angular. We're using UI Router. We're using Lodash and Angular Animate to get some nice smooth scrolling in a few places based on some data. And then we have a few of our own app files as well. So for the index page, there's nothing too interesting here really. Most of this is boilerplate code for generating a top nav and a side nav bar. The only thing of real note here is the UIView. So more evidence of us using the UI Router third-party library here. So let's take a look now at how we set that up. Over in app.js, you can see our app module and the list of our app dependencies, and then the config block with each of the states for our application. We have one for the products page, configure, summary, and home. Nothing too interesting here, nothing out of the ordinary. This is a pretty straightforward setup for a state setup for your application. We just have templates controllers. A couple of these have resolves where we fetch some data about the products prior to landing on the page. So let's take a look at something a little more interesting now. Let's dig into the products page in particular. So here we have products.jade. This first Twitter Bootstrap column, is the controls that we see right here. So this is how we generate all of these inputs that we use to filter the data. So we do this by repeating over a set of common values associated with our data. So if we take a look back at the application again, we see that all of the products have a manufacturer, an item type, and a subtype. So those common types are isolated and then pulled out, and a section here for these inputs is created for each group. Then we ng repeat over each one of the values in that subgroup. So looking back at the application again, we see that Mountain Disk, Flintstone, Kerplunk, Acme are all options underneath this manufacturer category. So we tie all these together with an ng click that essentially sets a key value pair associated with that particular item that was clicked on. So keep that in mind, that we have this mechanism storing that key value pair, and we'll see how that comes into play in our filter here in a second. At the top, we also have this input for where a user can type in a name to help filter the results that way as well. So let's take a look at how we generated this list right here of products. So we have an ng switch on this current view. So we've only shown really the tile view at this moment, but there's a denser data view that we can show. But let's just focus on the tile view. All the code behind this is right here. A div with a class of sorted and a description tile directive that we are repeating for every item and products.displayList, so the return value of that function on our scope. So let's take a look at that. We'll open products.js and see how that works. So here you can see our controller. If you look back at our data structure here for our files, we see app, and then inside that is the products folder. Often when we build our applications, we'll actually model our modules following that same pattern, so that the module name, in this case app.products, maps the folder path to where that file is located for that module. And here we have our controller and the controller properties right here. The one in particular that we're interested in at the moment is the displayList property. We can see that that is equivalent to the displayList function. Now here we actually see what this displayList function is doing. It's taking the product list and using Lodash to extract each item from that list for us to perform some sort of calculation on. And what we're doing is also iterating over each of the property filters, just looking to see if those properties match up. And if it passes all those checks, then that item is returned with the result of this filter. So by binding directly to a function call, we're able to see this list update in real time as these properties change, forcing the display list to refire, resulting in the number of items in this ng repeat to update, displaying each of these tiles independently. So in addition to the products page, we also have another directive in use on the configure page. So there we can see right at the top, the very first thing we see is this ModelNumber directive. This is what we use to produce this piece of information right here. So by passing in a base piece of product information and the options that the user has currently selected, we get that display simply by specifying that I want to show a model number. In addition to that, we have all of the features and their options displayed below it. And here we can see that that was created using a table, and we're just repeating over all of the levels in a configuration object on this particular scope. Here we also see that we're repeating over all of the options associated with this particular level or feature. So putting all of this together, we have the model number table. Each of these rows is a result of an ng repeat. Each of these options is a result of another ng repeat. So what about the data validation? How does that work? Well, here we can see we have a button danger level.valid. So on this previous column right here, when something becomes invalid, we see that this particular set of data switches out. And that comes from this right here, an ng class tying it to the validity of a level. And because this validity of a level is not something that is hard-coded, it's actually dependent upon the other data, you have to associate that with a scope function. So let's take a look at how we do that. So here's our configure controller, and we start off actually setting this function to false. But if you look up here, we're actually doing a watch on this controller's selections, so that anytime a user changes anything in that selections data set, it will run this product data service.getValidity and then call an UpdateAll. So for now, we will assume that this product data service getValidity does exactly what it sounds like and obtains the validity for the current set of options. So let's take a look at UpdateAll. So here, as the user clicks around and chooses those options, that can potentially invalidate the actual options they've selected on. It can also add and remove the various features or levels, as well as which options can be shown, which means the selections that the user has made may or may not need to be updated as well. So here, with each input, we have a complex relationship of things that need to be updated. You can see here that we are, at this point, actually updating the validity to the result of a function that is obtained in our state service. So that's kind of an interesting piece of code. So let's dive in one step deeper and investigate that as well. So here we have our data services module, which contains two primary services: the product data service and the product state service. The product data service is responsible for fetching and manipulating the data as needed. The product state service is responsible for understanding the state of the product as it exists at this moment. So let's take a look back at configure.js. The thing that we're interested in is the product state service.valid. So here we can look for a .valid. And this will use Lodash to look at every level that we currently have, or again feature that we currently have for this product, and returns its validity. So here we're just kind of nesting this valid call one level deep and inspecting whether all of these levels are valid, and if they are, then we return true. So we can kind of see how we've got this actually relatively complex rule set backing this application and its ability to automatically perform all of these calculations and changes to the product. So again, I made this selection, which required this list to change, which required a reevaluation of all the rules to determine the validity. And again, every selection here requires that check be put in place. So that's updating the state of the application, updating all of the values, then updating all the validity statements. Finally, that all trickles back up inside this UpdateAll. And this is what makes the scope properties, and displays the controller properties, aware of this data, making them available on our view. And UpdateAll was called as a result of a watch being fired on the selections made by the user. So there's quite a bit of work going on there behind the scenes, but as far as updating the view, we've not had to do anything. If we go back to configure.jade, we just see that we're simply binding to that top level input right here, level.valid, to determine the validity. And then by using ng-repeat over our level options and our configuration levels, the rest of the UI is generated for us automatically, so long as our state is updated consistently. So that's by far the most complex portion of the application, the configuration section. So let's take a look at something more light, a little more light, and go into the directives that we created for this. So the one directive I've already mentioned was the description tile. And this is one of my favorite directives. It's really simple. We have a panel where we have an ng class that determines exactly how we should style it based on how it's used. We actually pass in a click function from the outside. That way the context in which we are clicking on this changes depending on where this directive is used. We pass in the base label to display in the heading. And then we have this star icon that we show whether or not this is actually a featured product or not. Then we dynamically bind in the product image as well as the data. So there's nothing too much to this. And the JavaScript behind it is even simpler. We just have the DDO with the basic information, a restrict, a template URL, and the scope properties that we're going to be displaying. The reason I like this so much is how it's the perfect example of the power and flexibility of directives. Here we are again on the products page. We saw all of this information stamped out for us, updating live as the user interacts with the application, and we didn't have to do any coding other than to say that it is our intent to actually display these tiles here, one for every item that is currently in the results set. And we get to extend that functionality and make it reusable in other places inside the application. So let's take a look at the other directive, the ModelNumber. So again, this is another simple directive, but the simplicity is what really makes it nice. So here we're binding in the product name, the number text with an ng repeat for all of the user's current selections, and some CSS to handle the alternating striping of the model number at the top. So nothing special there. And in the JavaScript, it says equally simple as the description tile. But what we get out of that is a one-line piece of HTML that we can drop anywhere we need to see the model number. And in fact, we do that same thing in the summary screen. So after they've configured their product, they move on to the summary screen. We can see again, here's another usage of that model number, and here's another usage of the description tile. So a couple things about the Angular code that I wanted to point out. We briefly looked at the configure pages controller. Just want to point out how we're utilizing, for the most part, we're utilizing John Papa's style guide, intentionally taking bits and pieces from it that we found to be helpful. In particular, the aliasing of the controller object instead of using this directly, and that allows us to get by with referring inside of functions to the controller object without this keyword possibly being changed in the context in which it's used. We're also using the controller as syntax, so that way we can reference our controller directly. We can see that by the app.js. We have configure controller as configure, or as CFG. And then again in our template we see CFG, so we're referencing this controller directly. We're also separating out our controller properties, which are these right here, from the rest of the controller setup. I'm isolating out these functions, and it makes it really easy to know right away what's on the controller, what parts are related to Angular versus which parts are specific for how the application works regardless of Angular. So for example, if I want to come back and I need to edit the way the options display function works, I don't have to try and figure out if that's a scope function, if it's a regular function. All I have to do is find the options display function and edit it directly. And this code here is responsible for whether or not that should be assigned to the scope. So it's a nice separation of concerns there. Another interesting piece to look at is the welcome page. In this controller we do something a little different than you would normally see in a lot of apps. After establishing our controller properties, we actually make this product data service.getProductList call. Now, normally you would seek a service call like this, followed by a .then and then some sort of consumption of that data. But here we're actually utilizing how promises work to perform a prefetch. So let's take a look at the GetProductList. That's going to be in our data.js file, and that's going to be in our product data services service at GetProductList. So the very first thing this function does is it checks to see if there is some object called series_data_promise. If there isn't, then it performs the rest of this block of code. If there is, it just returns that series_data_promise. So if it isn't, it establishes it by making an HTTP call, getting the data, and the rest of this is about processing that data to massage the legacy shape of the data for the consumption of our client application. So what's so interesting about this code? Well, if we look back at app.js, we can see on the products page that the resolve block is requesting productDataService.getProductList. So if you have used Resolve before, you understand that this function right here must return a promise that will resolve with the data that we want to use at product list if we want to navigate to this route. So going back to our data, productDataService.getProductList will create and store a series data promise object if it hasn't already been called. If it has, it simply returns that promise. So by landing on the home page, we're calling this getProductList, firing off the request, storing that promise, with the knowledge in hand that the most likely place the user is going to go next is that product list page. Upon navigating there, it fires off this request for the data, noticing that it has already been made, and returns the promise that was already in the process of being fulfilled, and can skip some of that download of that data because it's already taken place, and we can simply return the result that was returned earlier, or wait for that to finish, and we don't lose that time of fetching it again. So it's just a nifty little optimization trick that you can do if you can cache your data for a client session. So those are really some of the highlights of the application. If you guys have any questions, I appreciate you contacting us. Thank you.